in Edinburgh, and then rugby before going on to Oxford. Unlike many of his class, he developed a passionate interest in Gaelic. Although he had heard the language spoken on his father's Argyllshire estate, it began to grab hold of him in 1926 when, while attending a Highland Games in Oban, he heard 4 young island men speaking it. I had never heard Gaelic spoken like that, and I said to myself, that's something that I should have. He then took lessons from Hector MacLean, a Tiree man who was the factor on his father's estate. Back at Oxford, he continued to study the language with John Fraser, Jesus Professor of Celtic, a native Gaelic speaker from Inverness-shire. By the time of his 1932 trip to Cape Breton, Campbell had already substantially completed his first major work of Gaelic scholarship, Highland Songs of the 45, published in 1933 by John Grant, although, as we see in this slide, republished in the 1980s by the Scottish Gaelic Text Society. In his introduction, Campbell argued that the 45 was, quotes, the natural reaction of the Jacobite clans and their sympathizers in the Highlands against what had been, since the coming of William of Orange in 1690, a calculated official genocidal campaign against the religion of many and the language of all Highlanders. This was provocative stuff at the time, and as was his criticism of, quotes, many Scottish and practically all English writers on the period for their ignorance of Gaelic and of Gaelic sources. As we shall see, the Canadian Gael, MacKinnon, would have been sympathetic to such views. 1932 was a difficult year for Campbell. His younger brother, Charles, had died, and Campbell had accompanied his mother to America in order to bury Charles' remains at the Waterbury family plot in Darien, Connecticut. His grandmother gave him some money and suggested he take a trip somewhere before returning to Britain. He decided to go to Nova Scotia. His choice was not a surprising one for a young man already well-grounded in the history of the Highlands and with a growing passion for the Gaelic language and culture. After the Battle of Culloden, which brought the 45 to a disastrous end for the Jacobites, huge social, economic, and cultural changes swept the Highlands and resulted in the emigration of tens of thousands of Gaels in the second half of the 18th century and throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. By the 1770s, these emigrants set their sights on what is now Eastern Canada, and particularly on Prince Edward Island, the counties of Pictou and Antigonish on the eastern mainland of Nova Scotia, and Cape Breton Island. The impact of Gaelic settlement in Canada is apparent from research which has been done on the Canadian Census of 1901 by John Dembling. It is estimated that there were at least 90,000 Gaelic speakers in Canada, almost half as many Gaelic speakers as there were in Scotland at the time, making Gaelic the 4th most widely spoken language in the country. Upwards of 50,000 Gaelic speakers resided in Nova Scotia alone, and in many parts of Cape Breton and some parts of Antigonish County, which you see here on the map, Gaelic speakers made up greater than 80% of the local population. These communities were as strongly Gaelic as any in Scotland. Campbell was only able to spend a week in Nova Scotia on his 1932 visit, but he accomplished a great deal. On his first day in Sydney, Cape Breton, Campbell met several Nova Scotia Gaels, including Donald MacKinnon, the brother of our second remarkable Gael, Jonathan G. MacKinnon. And the next day, the 12th of April, Campbell records that he met MacKinnon himself, from whom he, quotes, received much useful information in a long talk. It appears that MacKinnon made a profound impact on Campbell. Recalling in 1950 his first meeting with MacKinnon, John Lorne Campbell reported that, quote, his words were so full of good sense and substance that I've reflected on many occasions that he could have filled a Gaelic chair in any university. Campbell also wrote that, quotes, certainly I am of the opinion that there was never in this century a person who was more zealous with regard to the Gaelic language and its literature and history than Jonathan MacKinnon. High praise indeed coming from Campbell, who distinguished himself as a remarkable scholar and advocate for the language in the 20th century. From Campbell's notes, we get a good sense of what he had learned from MacKinnon at this first meeting. They discussed Mac-Talla, which MacKinnon had edited and published from 1892 to 1904, to this day the only weekly and laterally bi-weekly Gaelic newspaper that has ever been published for an extended period. They also discussed other periodical publishing in Nova Scotia. They talked about the very limited presence of Gaelic in Nova Scotia schools and the more significant presence in the churches. Campbell notes that 18 to 20 Presbyterian congregations in Cape Breton had services in Gaelic, and that most of the Catholic congregations were also Gaelic speaking. And MacKinnon referred to other places in Canada where the language was still spoken. Perhaps inspired by this information, here we see Mac-Talla, this remarkable newspaper. It itself could be the subject of a presentation or more, but I'll only touch it peripherally tonight. Perhaps inspired by this information, Campbell decided to make an unofficial Gaelic census, comprising a series of questions directed to the clergy in various districts identified by MacKinnon. The total number, here's the front page of the Gaelic census, which Campbell had made. The total number Campbell enumerated was 15,425 Gaelic speakers, but he noted that it would not have been surprising if the actual total was twice that figure, had he been able to conduct more thorough researches. Campbell's unofficial census has proved very useful to later research on the demographics of Gaelic in Eastern Canada, and particularly in Eastern Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island. The next day, Wednesday, 13th April, Campbell again met Donald and Jonathan MacKinnon. Jonathan gave him 8 copies of his most recent periodical venture, Fair na Céile, which MacKinnon had published on a monthly basis between 1928 and 1930. MacKinnon also showed Campbell a manuscript of, in Campbell's words, no small interest on the settlement of Cape Breton, and another manuscript that he had prepared and was writing on the history of the Gaels. MacKinnon promised to find back issues of Mac-Talla for Campbell, who was clearly very interested in the paper. They visited the Mi'kmaq First Nation Reserve at Waikagama, the Mi'kmaq being the indigenous people of Nova Scotia and Eastern Canada, very near to where MacKinnon was born and raised. And MacKinnon gave Campbell his history of Cape Breton and his Gaelic translation of Tolstoy's short story, Where Love Is, There God Is Also, which MacKinnon had published in 1924. Campbell met MacKinnon one more time on this trip, on Thursday, the 14th of April in Sydney. MacKinnon gave Campbell back issues of Mac-Talla, as well as some Gaelic terms peculiar to Cape Breton Island, and the two men discussed Scottish history. As their subsequent correspondence reveals, there had clearly been a meeting of minds and of kindred spirits, and the foundations of this remarkable friendship had been firmly laid. What of Jonathan G. MacKinnon? He was born on the 2nd of September, 1869 in Dunaikin, Inverness County, Cape Breton, a settlement near Waikagama, where he died on the 13th of April, 1944. He was therefore 62 years of age when he met the 25-year-old Campbell in 1932. MacKinnon's father, Angus, was born at Carnostel in the township of Pain Chani in the district of Uig, the Isle of Skye, in 1830. He had emigrated to Cape Breton in 1840. MacKinnon's mother, Catherine Gillis, was also a native of Skye, having been born in Kilmuir, the north end of the island, in 1831. Professor Charles Dunn of Harvard University relates that as a young boy, MacKinnon was something of an invalid and could not attend school regularly, but that, while confined to the house, quotes, he spent his time acquiring information about his Gaelic forefathers. It appears that MacKinnon's health was poor later in life as well. In his correspondence with Campbell, he frequently discusses it and the restrictions that it imposed upon him. MacKinnon grew up in a Gaelic-speaking home, which was apparently rich in Gaelic oral tradition. MacKinnon himself noted later in life, for example, that he had been hearing Gaelic songs all his life. Campbell gives us this description of him, quotes, Jonathan MacKinnon was a man of middling height, thick-set, and rather slow in both his movement and his speech. In English, he had a Canadian accent, but in Gaelic, he had an Isle of Skye accent. MacKinnon started his education at the local country school at Waikagama, but carried on at the secondary level at the Sydney Academy, one of the best secondary schools in Nova Scotia. The Sydney Academy almost certainly had a profound impact on him. Like many such institutions in the far-flung colonies of the British Empire in the late 19th century, it was strongly Anglo-normative and imperialist in its intellectual orientation. Although MacKinnon forswore any party politics in Mac-Talla, he wrote that, quote, Mac-Talla will not take one side or the other in questions of matters of government. As Campbell has noted, the newspaper was imperialist and a firm supporter of the temperance movement. At Sydney Academy, MacKinnon would have received a thorough grounding in the canon of English literature and in a wider range of popular material translated from other traditions into English. This was precisely the sort of material which MacKinnon went on in later life to translate into rich, idiomatic Gaelic. At Sydney Academy, MacKinnon also edited the school magazine, the Sydney Academy Record. And this appears to have whetted his appetite for both writing and periodical publishing. After finishing his secondary schooling, he did not proceed to higher education, instead turning his energy at the relatively tender age of 22 to Mac-Talla. The Sydney Academy did prepare him for life after Mac-Talla folded, though, for MacKinnon went on to hold a number of civil service appointments in Sydney, and by all appearances, he was a diligent and competent civil servant, precisely as would be expected of a graduate of the Sydney Academy. A staunch Presbyterian, he was an elder in St. Andrew's Church, Sydney, and a member of its board of managers and a Bible class teacher. John Lorne Campbell returned to Britain in late April 1932, and shortly thereafter, he and MacKinnon began a regular and quite prolific correspondence, which lasted almost until MacKinnon's death. I have been able to read a large number of MacKinnon's letters in the Canna House archives. Unfortunately, I've had less luck with Campbell's letters to MacKinnon. There is valuable material in the MacKinnon holdings at the Beaton Institute at Cape Breton University, and I should also like to thank and acknowledge the assistance given to me by the staff there, but little from Campbell. Nonetheless, some of the contents of Campbell's correspondence can be inferred from MacKinnon's letters. The two men met on only two other occasions in 1937. Campbell had moved to the Isle of Barra in 1933, and in 1935 he married Margaret Fay Shaw, a young American who had been living in South Uist, recording Gaelic songs and other folklore there, some of which formed the basis of her important book, Folk Songs and Folklore of South Uist, first published in 1955. Campbell was also collecting Gaelic songs and folklore with the help of notable Gaelic informants such as Annie Johnston, John McPherson, known as the Coddy, and Father John McMillan. Campbell was fascinated by new technology and was one of the first to use an Ediphone to record Gaelic material. Here we see Campbell's Ediphone, which still can be seen at Canna House. In the summer of 1937, John and Margaret traveled to Nova Scotia with a view to renewing the acquaintances he had made in 1932, but, as importantly, to see what traditions that were brought from Scotland were still alive amongst the descendants of the emigrant Gaels, and to record these traditions and examples of dialects preserved in the New World on his Ediphone. They stayed 6 weeks in Cape Breton and recorded a large number of old country songs, as well as some locally composed songs and various other items of interest. Campbell published much of this material in his 1990 book, Songs Remembered in Exile. The importance of these recordings cannot be overstated. They are the first sound recordings of Gaelic material to be made in Nova Scotia, and they give us a fascinating insight into the repertoires and performance standards of several significant Cape Breton informants of the day. Their first stop in Cape Breton was at Waikagama. Here's the picture that I used to advertise this event. It shows John Lorne Campbell in the front with the smart-looking hat on, finishing off what looks to be a bottle of soda pop, although in Cape Breton it could also be moonshine. I would guess it's soda pop or water. And we see MacKinnon on the other side of the car, in the passenger seat, looking mightily happy, it has to be said. A very big smile on his face, happy to obviously be seen, to be photographed in John Lorne's company. This car, incidentally, had been brought by the Campbells from the UK for the purposes of their voyage. At this first meeting on the second trip, they talked about Mac-Talla. MacKinnon noted that he wrote much of the content himself, but that some of the best articles he published were contributed by Donald MacKinnon, the first professor of Celtic at Edinburgh. And this is another example of the links between Gaelic Scotland and Gaelic Canada. Mac-Talla was a huge piece of work by MacKinnon, but he did have contributors, and many of those, such as Donald MacKinnon, John McCrory, and others, were Scottish Gaels who were keen on supporting MacKinnon's efforts. Campbell and MacKinnon talked about the state of the language in Cape Breton. MacKinnon estimated that there could have been no less than 40 to 50,000 Gaelic speakers in the maritime provinces as a whole, with the most in Cape Breton, but that the language was beginning to decline, owing to an unfortunate combination of circumstances, although rural depopulation was a significant one. This was a perceptive observation. Subsequent sociolinguistic research done in the 1980s has confirmed that the 1930s was a key period in the decline of the language in Cape Breton. MacKinnon also reported that he had translated into Gaelic Henry Van Dyke's short story, The Other Wise Man, first published in 1896, and Thomas Hardy's The Three Strangers, first published in 1883, and some Tolstoy, and that he hoped to translate Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island and other of Stevenson's works. MacKinnon took John and Margaret to visit the Isle of Muck descendants at Waikagama and nearby Lake Ainslie, some of whom Campbell recorded. Campbell noted that one of the best singers was a 12-year-old boy, Neil D. MacKinnon, and remarked that the Gaels of Cape Breton have preserved the best traditions of Highland hospitality. And here we see an entry from his logbook for Friday the 10th, which says that they visited Ainslie Glen and Kirkwood in the company of MacKinnon. Good soup from the Mokani, Ainslie Glen. That is the MacKinnons who descended from Isle of Muck people. After touring many Gaelic settlements in Cape Breton, John and Margaret returned to Waikagama, quotes, to leave our farewell with Jonathan G. MacKinnon, who throughout our stay in Cape Breton had taken the greatest interest in our work. MacKinnon also took them to see the chief of the Mi'kmaq, the First Nations people in the area, Gabriel Silabui, quotes, an intelligent middle-aged man who quickly understood what we wanted and agreed to make a record for us. The next day, Silabui recorded in Mi'kmaq his grandfather's account of the arrival of the first Scottish settlers. This was to be the last time that MacKinnon and the Campbells met in person. The surviving correspondence reveals a friendship based on the mutual sharing of material, information, opinions, support, and crucially, respect, and a friendship which was beneficial for both men and for those of us who follow. For example, MacKinnon continued to provide Campbell with information on the state of Gaelic in the region, estimates of numbers of speakers, of clergy who use the language, and so forth. It appears from the correspondence that Campbell regularly provided news about what was going on in Scotland, particularly as regards the Highlands and Islands. Campbell was, during this time, very active in agitating on behalf of the Hebridean fishing industry, along with Compton Mackenzie and others. And he sent MacKinnon regular updates on what was happening on that front. In one letter, MacKinnon noted that the large trawlers had also been a menace to fishermen of the Canadian maritime provinces as well, and ventured the opinion that, quotes, for many years past, big business has been killing off the little fellows. But he noted with approval a minority opinion in a recent US Supreme Court judgment that, and I quote from the letter, quotes, uncontrolled competition can no longer be regarded as being in the best interests of the people. I think this is a very good example of the sort of intellect and sort of mind that MacKinnon had. Fine writer in Gaelic and English, interested in the affairs of his own people, but also keenly aware of the changes that were going about in the world and very concerned about them as well. This was not the first time that MacKinnon voiced such opinions. In his journal Fearna Céilí, which appeared at the very end of the Roaring Twenties and at the time of the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the start of the Great Depression, MacKinnon displayed a strong social conscience, noting critically, for example, the growing gap between rich and poor that was evident in the big cities of Canada and America. He said in one entry in the journal, "Harutikin kar rian an túl an uad a ha cúis marshon." He wrote in 1928, "There's something wrong with the way that the world is organized when things are like this." Seems that Campbell regularly sent MacKinnon Gaelic books, including Campbell's own edition of the poetry of Shawnee Campbell, the noted Southwest poet, which clearly pleased MacKinnon. In return, MacKinnon continued to send Campbell copies of Canadian Gaelic periodicals, including back issues of Mac-Talla, and indeed at Canna House, John Lorne Campbell's very fine collection of Mac-Talla can still be inspected. Of particular note is that Campbell assisted MacKinnon in the publication of the two translations referred to earlier. His translation of Van Dyck's The Other Wise Man under the title Scial and Drwy Ella in 1938, and of Hardy's The Three Strangers under the title An Trú Choicroch in 1944. In my opinion, this translation of Hardy is one of the finest that has been made into the Gaelic language. The correspondence reveals the very considerable support that Campbell had provided, which included writing to the original publishers for permissions, and, it appears, some financial support out of his own pocket. As early as 1933, however, the two men were corresponding with regard to the publication of a larger edited edition or editions of a broad selection of MacKinnon's writing. The editions never appeared. It appears that funding was an issue. In a letter of 1 January 1935, MacKinnon makes reference to a decision of a publishing committee. The context suggests that it was the Committee of Uncommon Gaelic, not to fund such a publication. The fact that some of MacKinnon's material were translations appears to have been an issue. MacKinnon writes, quotes, "If they want to make additions to Gaelic prose, idiomatic translations of good writings such as these ought to be of greater value than such original Gaelic writings as they may expect under present conditions." In a letter of 7 December 1933, MacKinnon notes that he had started making selections of his material in Mac-Talla for the purpose of these proposed volumes. He makes reference to a separate book. It appears that one collection would be based on Mac-Talla and the other would draw on his other work, particularly his translations. He had suggested the inclusion of the Van Dyck and the Tolstoy short stories, but noted that, quotes, "both are of a religious nature, and some readers might not want them. I do not know if there's anything of a sectarian cast in either, but others might not agree." In general, MacKinnon looked to Campbell for guidance and showed a considerable willingness to defer to Campbell's editorial judgments. As these were presumably to be published in Scotland, and as Scottish readers were expected to form the largest market for such publications, MacKinnon's deference was in part practical. Surely his respect for Campbell's judgment and perhaps his gratitude for the interest shown by Campbell in his work were also factors. Indeed, in a 1935 letter, MacKinnon concludes with the following words: "Your interest in my work revived my own in it. In fact, gave me the idea that what I had been doing was worthwhile, even though I had lost by it." Presumably, this is a reference to the loss-making Mac-Talla and some other Gaelic publishing ventures that only led to costs out of his pocket, and seemed to have gained nothing. Hukshiv urachug mishni gong. You have renewed my confidence and morale. In March 1937, MacKinnon wrote to Campbell, the second quote we see here: "I was really glad to hear from you and think it very good of you, very, very good of you to be determined on having some of my work made available to the Gaelic public when the, quotes, well-known Gaelic enthusiasts do nothing to assist you. You are the only one, I may say, from whom I have received any recognition or encouragement in what I have done or am doing in the Gaelic line. And lazy as I have been in writing," he often made reference to his delays in returning correspondence, "I appreciate what you have done for me, as well as what you are now about to do," presumably in reference to the publication of the first of the two translations in 1938. MacKinnon did, however, have strong views about orthographic, in spite of his willingness to allow Campbell latitude in making many editorial decisions. MacKinnon did have strong views about orthographical and related matters, but was not doctrinal about things, and again showed a willingness in the correspondence to adhere, or at least to listen to Campbell's views. Space does not permit a consideration of some of the interesting linguistic and editorial issues that MacKinnon and Campbell were discussing. But given that MacKinnon was perhaps the most significant writer and publisher of Gaelic prose that has ever existed, such views deserve wider consideration. We do, however, get an idea of the emphasis which MacKinnon placed on the spoken language and of the native idiom in setting the standard for good Gaelic expression, whether orally and in writing. We see this in a quote from a letter of the 13th of February, 1938 to Campbell. "The fountainhead of Gaelic is not in writings, but in the common speech of the ordinary Gaelic-speaking people, especially of those who speak Gaelic alone. The writings of today are not as true to Gaelic idiom as were those of 100 and more years ago. Writers whose mother tongue was Gaelic have unknowingly brought English ways of saying things into the old tongue, and the compilers of songbooks have not hesitated to doctor choruses and verses in order to bring them into line with their understanding of English." He opens up very interesting questions about the relationship between the two languages, about aesthetic standards, and so forth, which deserve fuller attention and discussion, issues that trouble us and make us think still as both editors and producers of Gaelic prose and poetry. Campbell, of course, became a highly proficient writer and speaker of Gaelic, but learners of Gaelic may take comfort from the fact that even Campbell received some help on his way to fluency. In the postscript to a December 1933 letter, MacKinnon praised the quality of Campbell's writing in an article which Campbell had sent him, but added that, as he took the article to be Campbell's, commented that, quotes, "I know that you will not mind my noting some few errors," and proceeded to make some corrections in relation to, mainly to mistakes in idiom. Like any good learner, Campbell understood that to be a good speaker, you need to make mistakes. And it appears that Campbell did not mind these suggestions as their friendship only grew. On the 1932 and the 1937 trip, John Lorne Campbell made many other enduring friendships. One was with the Reverend Dr. Patrick J. Nicholson, a professor of physics at St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, Nova Scotia, a university founded in the 19th century by Scottish Highlanders and their descendants. Nicholson was a native Gaelic speaker from Beaver Cove, Cape Breton, who in 1944 would go on to be president of the university, a post which he held until 1954. He was of Barra ancestry and was related to Campbell's important Barra informant, Annie Johnston. Nicholson was extremely interested in Gaelic oral tradition, and from the early 1920s until 1944, edited a regular Gaelic column, Achag na Gael, the Field of the Gaels, in the Antigonish weekly newspaper, The Casket. He provided Campbell with many contacts. By Campbell's own admission, Nicholson provided John and Margaret, quotes, the greatest encouragement. Like MacKinnon, Nicholson maintained a long correspondence with Campbell, and that's something that I hope to explore on some other occasion. Indeed, until COVID intervened, I planned in the spring of this year to take a look at Patrick Nicholson's significant holdings at both St. Francis Xavier Library, and there are some very interesting items at the Beaton Institute as well. Hopefully 2021 will give me that chance. The links with St. Francis Xavier University, here you see it, a university, John Lorne Campbell has noted, with strong Scottish Highland associations, were strong and enduring. On a 1946 trip to North America, John and Margaret's first since 1937, they went to Nova Scotia. John took instruction in the Catholic faith at St. Francis Xavier and was received into the Catholic Church at the Cathedral of St. Ninian in Antigonish. In 1953, Campbell was invited to attend the celebrations marking the centenary of the establishment of St. Francis Xavier, and he was on that occasion granted an honorary doctorate. Other important friendships formed through St. Francis Xavier included those with Reverend Malcolm MacDonnell, a native Gaelic speaker from Hillsdale, Inverness County, Cape Breton, who taught history there and went on to serve as president of the university from 1970 to 1978, but who had also collected folklore in Cape Breton. And Sister Margaret MacDonnell, Reverend MacDonnell's sister, as well as a nun who had completed her doctorate in Celtic at Harvard and taught in the Celtic department at St. Francis Xavier until 1986. I should note that Sister Margaret is still alive and is still very sharp. She will be 100 years of age next month, and I'm looking forward to sending her a wee something to celebrate this momentous occasion and achievement. A fascinating example of John Lorne Campbell's enduring and highly significant links with Nova Scotia is revealed in the story of a 17-year-old Gaelic enthusiast from Ohio in the United States. The young man had heard about a woman from the Midwest, Margaret Fay Shaw, who lived on the Isle of Canna and was married to a notable Gaelic scholar. In 1961, the young man wrote to Campbell in, by his own admission, less than perfect Gaelic, and received a reply in Gaelic, which, once the young man had deciphered the letter, included an invitation to come to Canna and to spend the summer there, working on the farm and learning Gaelic. The young man was John Shaw, who was preparing to enter Harvard University to study linguistics and German languages. Campbell knew that there was much research to be done on the rich Gaelic traditions of Cape Breton and encouraged Shaw to pursue his studies in that direction. In the summer of 1963, following his first year at Harvard, Shaw spent the summer in Cape Breton, staying with Father John Angus Rankin at the Glebe House in Glendale, Inverness County, at which time he began to make his first recordings of Cape Breton Gaelic informants. Shaw went on to complete a master's degree in Gaelic language, literature, and linguistics at Harvard, and his Harvard doctoral thesis, based on his fieldwork with the outstanding Cape Breton Gaelic informant, Joneil McNeill, which was ultimately published by McGill Queen's University Press in Canada in 1987 as Sciel Galaw, Tales Until Dawn, the world of a Cape Breton Gaelic storyteller, an immensely important collection of Gaelic folklore from Nova Scotia. Dr. John Shaw has noted that John Lorne Campbell was one of the best Gaelic scholars of his generation, but was also very concerned about social conditions in the Highlands and was a, quotes, real crusader, and was, for Shaw, quotes, a great example in a lot of ways. Dr. Shaw has referred to Campbell as a good friend and spoke of his generosity, noting that Campbell would send books to him, quotes, things that he knew I would be interested in, a revealing echo of Campbell's friendship with MacKinnon, and that, in his own way, Campbell was an excellent teacher. Dr. Shaw's contribution to the preservation of Gaelic in Nova Scotia is inestimable and is testament to the value and the wisdom of John Lorne Campbell's advice. In addition to his own prodigious recording, Dr. Shaw was, between 1978 and 1983, engaged as the field worker on the Nova Scotia Gaelic Folklore Project, a project in which Sister Mac-Talla played a role in establishing with the assistance of the Canadian federal government and another prominent Nova Scotia Gael, Alan J. McKechnie, the late Alan J. McKechnie, a Gaelic speaker who rose to the highest levels in the Canadian government of Pierre Trudeau. John recorded around 2,000 items of folklore, including over 1,100 songs. This material is held at the St. Francis Xavier University Library and has been digitized and is now available online. In addition to Tales Until Dawn, Dr. Shaw has edited 3 other important collections of material: Lurcan Achanil, Folk Tales from Cape Breton with Margaret Mac-Talla, based on the repertoire of Hector Campbell of Hillsdale, Cape Breton, who also had provided material to Patrick Nicholson and Malcolm Mac-Talla. Brí an Áran, a story in every song, based on the repertoire of the outstanding Broadcove Cape Breton informant Lochy McClellan, and Na Beantaigh an Garama agus Scéal Loch Ganella Cape Breton, the Blue Mountains and other Gaelic stories from Cape Breton, a representative sample of the rich and varied body of Gaelic oral narrative in Cape Breton. Dr. Shaw's fieldwork recordings and publications are now playing an important part in Gaelic revitalization efforts in Nova Scotia. Although such efforts have a long history in Nova Scotia, there have been some notable successes in recent years, a phenomenon that my colleague Dr. Stuart Dunbar has been exploring, supported by a British Academy Fellowship. Innovative educational programming such as Stóra Savala, a Gaelic immersion folklife course, a school run by Ballad and Gael, the Nova Scotia Highland Village Museum, a constituent part of the Nova Scotia Museum Service, has played an important role in developing the linguistic and cultural skills of young Gaelic speakers in Nova Scotia, and has developed a sense not only of a passion for the language, but a commitment to its maintenance and preservation, equipping a new generation of Gaelic speakers in Nova Scotia with a desire to not let this important part of our heritage slip away. Using materials such as those for which Dr. Shaw is responsible, the school aims to equip these younger learners of the language and others who are interested with enhanced linguistic and cultural skills and a greater cultural and social awareness and commitment. Much can be learned in Scotland from such innovative programming. We are still very rich in Gaelic tradition, but much can be learned about how to put that to effect in our present circumstances. And it would behoove policymakers to take a closer look at some of the really quite remarkable things that are going on in Nova Scotia, thanks in part to the inspiration of people like Dr. Shaw. However, John Shaw has made a significant contribution to Gaelic in Scotland as well, as one of many examples will show. After coming to live in Scotland in the early 1990s, he helped to develop the concept which led to the Tupper and Duachish project, which involved the digitization of sound recordings made by the School of Scottish Studies at the University of Edinburgh, by the BBC, and by John Lorne Campbell at Canna House. Much of this material is now accessible via the Tupper and Duachish website. In this lecture, I've focused on just one set of stories which illustrate the profound links between Gaelic Scotland and Canada. There are many, many others. These links are historical, but as I hope I've shown, they're also contemporary. In closing, I would like to encourage policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic to enhance these links. In October 2002, a memorandum of understanding was signed between the province of Nova Scotia and Highland Council that outlined areas of joint interest and cooperation to strengthen Gaelic language and culture on both sides of the ocean. It has been periodically renewed. However, perhaps it is time for the Scottish government to enter into such agreement with Nova Scotia, or indeed with the Canadian government. The United Kingdom is party to the Council of Europe's European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages, under which a wide range of commitments have been made in respect of Gaelic. Under Article 14, the UK has agreed to apply existing bilateral and multilateral agreements which bind them with the states in which the same language is used in identical or similar form, or if necessary, to seek to conclude such agreements in such a way as to foster contacts between the users of the same language in the states concerned in the fields of culture, education, information, vocational training, and permanent education. In reporting to the Council of Europe on compliance with this commitment, links such as the Nova Scotia Highlands Council MOU are sometimes referred to. However, more could be done, much more could be done. I hope that in this lecture, I have given you a taste of why the development of closer and more explicit links would be valuable and would be fitting recognition of the close Gaelic ties between our two countries. I also hope that the project that John Lorne Campbell and Jonathan G. MacKinnon had been planning, a representative collection of MacKinnon's writing, can also be completed. He has not been forgotten, either by Scottish or Nova Scotia Gaels, but I am firmly of the opinion that his outstanding contributions to Gaelic literature and culture deserve to be better known and appreciated. And you see words here from John Lorne Campbell on the death of MacKinnon in 1944. He was always zealous concerning the Gaelic language and concerning the reputation of the Gaels, and he would not put up with any contempt or disrespect directed at either by anyone. He had the opportunity to receive, had he had the opportunity to receive a university education, I am certain that he would have reached the highest levels of scholarship. He didn't have much worldly wealth, and he was often troubled with bad health and shamefully the indifference of many a person who should have been encouraging him. All Gaels, wherever they may be, should remember Jonathan MacKinnon as a person who stood up for and fought on behalf of and worked for his mother tongue and its literature with learning and with patience. Tapal of Gomor, Ason Achoram, Tashpina go Horshachat Noch. Thank you very much for the opportunity to present this topic tonight. And I'd also like to thank all of you who have tuned in to listen to me for a while. I hope that you enjoyed it. Tapal of.
Thank you so much for that, Rob. That was a really brilliant lecture. I've learned so much this evening. We've got a few questions from the attendees, so I'll run through a few of those, if that's okay. Our first is from Saltire member Jeff Justice, who says, without doubt, there's been a serious effort to maintain Gaelic at a grassroots level in Nova Scotia. What examples can Scotland take from there to keep the language living in its native home?
It's a very good question, and I'd like to thank Goody for that. I think there are some interesting lessons, but again, we see in the story of some of the revitalization efforts of late in Nova Scotia, Scottish links. In 2004, Finlay MacLeod, who is a redoubtable campaigner on behalf of the language, Finlay in the 80s set up the Gaelic preschool movement, and more recently has been working on essentially informal methods of instruction in the language, using less emphasis on grammar and more on social interaction. And he was brought over to Nova Scotia to give some presentations on some of the work that he'd been doing. And out of this, they developed a program called Gaelic Ecbala, which involved essentially people learning, not in classroom settings, but in homes with native speakers, as well as fluent learners, using casual conversation and so forth to develop language skills. Out of this, a number of things have happened, but I would say that one of the important aspects of the efforts that have been made have been to try and marry up the younger learners of Gaelic with older native speakers. A second program was developed, a master and apprentice program. They went to California and they brought Professor Leanne Hinton of the University of California to Nova Scotia. Professor Hinton has been working in California with highly threatened indigenous languages and set up programs whereby young learners, ab initio learners, who were often relatives of an older native speaker, would work with the native speaker to develop their language skills. And they have developed a system not for ab initio learners, but for more developed learners working one-on-one with older native speakers. And this has been very beneficial. John Shaw certainly played a role in all of this, but there were other people as well. The person responsible for example, bringing Finlay MacLeod to Nova Scotia was Seamus Watson, dear friend of many of us, who worked at the Highland Village Museum. And the Folklife School, which I talked about in this presentation, was developed by Jim with the assistance of John, Susan Cameron at St. Francis Xavier Library and so forth. And I think these people, Jim and John, were close friends going back to the 80s. They developed a co-op which sought to develop the language in Nova Scotia. And a lot of the ideas that these two fellows and a couple of other colleagues developed at that time are ones that have ultimately had a big impact on some of the programming that we see now. But we're awaiting Stuart Dunbar's research to see what he has to say about what's going on in Nova Scotia right now. But my own impression is that there are a surprising number of young people in the sort of late teens to late 30s who have come to really high degrees of fluency, but have this really strong commitment to the language. And I think that that's something that deserves attention. So thank you for that short question, and sorry for the rather long-winded answer.
Excellent answer. It was an excellent answer. So Pader 1798 even asks, is there a Mac-Talla archive available to the public?
There is online. Solborostek have digitized almost all of the Mac-Talla that they have in their collection. There are some numbers missing, and I hope that there will be other sources. For example, Lorne Campbell had a very complete collection at Canna House. I can't remember if it was a complete collection or not, but it was certainly close. And other places in Nova Scotia have fairly complete collections. So I would hope that the small number of missing numbers can be filled in. There were over 500 of them. The paper came out every week for most of its 12-year existence. A really remarkable feat by a single man working essentially by himself with some help from his brother as a publisher and a printer in Sydney, Cape Breton. But yes, it is available. And I didn't give my email address, but I'm happy to circulate that. And I can send along the link to the website at Solborostek where the papers can be found online.
That's fantastic. That's good to know as well. We have a Gaelic question that I think Dolly's going to read for us. But in the meantime, we've got this question from Olivia. Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. I was wondering whether any parts of your research on John Lorne Campbell and Jonathan G. MacKinnon's discussions about Mac-Talla have already been published, and if not, whether anything will be published in the near future.
Not yet, but I'm hoping, I've done 2 or 3 presentations on MacKinnon, and I'm hoping that they will be. Perhaps this lecture will be published. I'd be very happy to have that done. There is a good biography of John Lorne Campbell, written by Ray Perman in 2010. And as I said, some of the basic biographical information I derived from that source. The man who gave away his island, 1980, John Lorne Campbell, who had purchased Canna in the late 1930s and ran it as a farm, as well as an archive. He turned it over to the National Trust of Scotland, and it's still managed by the National Trust. But it's a very, very good book. But I think we need a similar book on MacKinnon. He's one of my heroes and quite a remarkable figure.
Hello.
Hi there, Dolly. Are you ready with that question?
Well, it's a comment actually. Can you see me?
Thank you. Yes, we can see you. Thanks.
And it's from Tiber, Rob. It's from Tiber. And it's Hagra Mahen Rob. Hasoch a big halleluja. Mahen Rob. Hord yn orad agad rhwm gymwr. Jalaf, prison, do, o chadan mi mach chori. Ach, lle noch biadoch gyna sio bo Tiber falset. Eis agad cohawn. Okay?
Pap yn Tiber, mae fystw as yn eisio cast.
A ddweud mi, bi as yn eisio, chwyd sera sio hwgym am y text, agos chanila, o sydd a hafas, ffôn nŵr ag ymgwydog. Mae hyn y rob, chord yn orad agad gymwrym. Jalaf ffesion, do ian agos Seamus fagad y sy'n yng nghan syf began, o sio yng nghan syf began y faroch, mynwbydd ar carriage gylwch Seamus Mac-Talla nach Maron.
Glefa, hwg mi ymwneud ger Seamus, nyr fa mi ffrecost cest Jeff Goody. Seamus Watson, yes, Tiber was asking whether I would say something about Jim. I've gone back to the picture of Stora Savala. Thanks to Tiber for that. Yes, I didn't mention Seamus, who's one of my dearest friends. He passed away a couple of years ago, right at about this time of the year. He was a remarkable guy who had done a huge amount of collecting himself, and a lot of his work has appeared in print. Some of the collecting he did. Also, he did a number of radio broadcasts with BBC Radio Gaelic, and after he died early in 2019, the BBC rebroadcast 6 of those shows. 3 of them were on his song collections in Cape Breton, and they're absolutely priceless. But he's done a tremendous amount of work. He and John really were collaborators as well as close friends. I've put up the picture. You can see John in the center of the picture, and Seamus is just beside him by the doorway, gesticulating, as Seamus would do from time to time. He's also one of my heroes, right up there with MacKinnon.
Oh, thank you, Rob. We have another question from Charlie and Lucy Haggerty. I apologise if that's incorrect. Are there aspects of the Gaelic language and culture which survive in Nova Scotia which did not survive in Scotland?
It's a very good question. I think that there are 3 or 4 areas. Certainly some songs have survived in the diaspora that have either gone out of favor or been forgotten here. And this is another reason why John's massive collection and Jim's work as well is so valuable, because there are older songs which still survive in the tradition there. there were some very interesting survivals in terms of oral traditions. At least one Fenian lay, the old Fenian song associated with the very important Fenian tradition in Gaelic culture survive in Nova Scotia. Also, Cape Breton is known for its fiddle tradition in particular, and its step dance tradition. Those are very distinctive. We're pretty certain that these were traditions that were brought with the migrants, and step dancing in particular has survived as a very distinctive form of dance, which hasn't, there's some evidence that it survived in Scotland, but not to the present, although interest in it is being revived. And I think that's the interesting thing. One of Scotland's finest pipers and pipe makers, Hamish Moore, became very taken with the Cape Breton musical tradition, and helped with the Gaelic Arts Project in 1996 to fund a great summer school, which is still going in South Uist, Keolis. And the original conception was to bring musicians and singers from Cape Breton over to Uist and to match them up with locals, and to essentially reunite these traditions separated by time and an ocean. And the summer school is still going strong. In fact, Keolis is doing really remarkable work in South Uist. But there is this recognition, I think greater recognition now, of the closeness of the links and the importance of the links, and the dynamism of the links and the two-way nature of the exchange, which has probably always been there than ever before. And I think obviously the shrinking of our world has helped, but yeah, so there are a number of traditions, definitely. And it's a distinct culture. I mean, it continued to develop in the New World, as all cultures do. I like to say that, if we were to think about English language culture and never considered America, we would be only telling half the story. But in the Gaelic context, the Gaels brought with them their culture and developed it in a new setting, in different conditions, in interesting ways. We see that in some of the programming that's going on right now. So I think these exchanges and meetings and sharing are important for both sides in the enterprise.
Brilliant. And there's a related question here from Peter Stewart, which speaks to my own spooky heart here. To what extent has the folklore and supernatural elements of Gaelic tradition, fairies, the second sight, etc., been transmitted to Nova Scotia? Did Nova Scotia ever rustle up some seers?
Yes, absolutely. I mentioned certainly in John's publications, there's a lot of material, but there's been a lot of material recorded and is still transmitted. Years ago, Jim Watson, who Tiber had mentioned, that I had mentioned a little earlier, he took me to visit an old fiddler named Joe Kennedy, who lived in a fairly remote place on the western side of the island. And Joe had been quite a fine fiddler, but in his later years, he developed arthritis. And Joe said that there had once been 2 sheehan, that is fairy mounds, on his property, but the fairies weren't around any longer. And he said it was because the music had stopped. Once the music had stopped, the fairies ceased to come about. I also remember staying at a bed and breakfast in Cape Breton in the early 1990s, and the proprietor, Mr. Rankin, was talking about, I had just gone to visit a tremendous folklore informant named Dan Angus Beaton, who had all sorts of ghost stories and tales of the supernatural and so forth. And he believed passionately in the truth of these tales. And I told Mr. Rankin that I'd been to see Dan Angus, and he said, "Oh, that guy. Oh, he believes in the fairies and so forth." And I said, "Don't you believe in that, Mr. Rankin?" And he said, "No, not really." And Mr. Rankin's wife stepped in and stopped him and said, "Well, now, Donald, you say that, but I remember you always telling me about how one day when you were down at the pier, walking down to the pier, you thought that you had seen a cousin of yours walking up the other side of the road from the pier, and you called out to him and he never answered. And we found out later that day that he had drowned at the fishing. So Donald, what about that?" And Donald said, "Oh yeah, that's right. I did have that experience." So yes, those traditions were very strong and still survive. A great source, by the way, both John and Jim and others are quite interested in these traditions, and many of them have been recorded. There was an excellent quarterly journal that was published by another friend, Francis MacKinnon, called Ambraya, the Upper Ground, and it came out 4 times a year between 1993 and 2003. And it had all sorts of excellent Gaelic material, including supernatural beliefs. And it's available, it's been digitized and is now available through the St. Francis Xavier library as well. So once again, if anybody would like information on Ambraya, send it along to me. The Highland Village Museum, the Ballinagal that I talked about, which supports Stora Savala, they have a regular folklife magazine that comes out usually twice a year, and it contains a lot of stuff that was collected by Jim Watson and John Shaw. So there are quite a few sources. There was a very good magazine called Cape Breton's Magazine, which had a lot of material in English, but also in French. There are Acadian French settlements in Cape Breton and in Mi'kmaq, but they had some stuff relating to the supernatural as well. They had all of their 78 issues. The Cape Breton's Magazine came out about 3 times a year between 1972 and 1997 or 99. But the website has recently disappeared, and I've written to the proprietor, but I haven't heard back. So I'm hopeful that it'll reappear because it's a fabulous resource.
Thank you, Rob. We have one last question. It's from Isla Ratcliffe. And it's, do you think that the Gaelic language continues to have an influence on traditional instrumental music when much of this music is now played by non-Gaelic speakers?
It's a very interesting question. It's not my area of expertise, but John Shaw has written on this, and I'd be happy to send along a reference to Isla. It's not my particular area of expertise, so I'd be very cautious to hasten a response. There are people in attendance, such as Tiber himself, who is a very talented musician and would have some views on this. What I would say is that there was always a close relationship between particularly Strathspey and reels and the language through the push the bial, the mouth music that would often be sung as perhaps a mnemonic device, a device for memorizing tunes and the rhythms. And of course, the feature of the Strathspey is the extended note, the sort of Scotch snap, as it's called. And it fits the Gaelic language very well because of the long vowels that we have in Gaelic. Myself, I take a step back. I think that the musical traditions in Cape Breton are exceptional, but also extremely valuable. There is a worry that the tradition is changing, but to a certain extent, that is a result of the different performance venues. People are still playing in houses, certainly, but they play on stage, and some of the best players are now playing to a wider international audience that may not know the tradition as well. So that has an impact. Language loss for me is important in of itself. I think that the musical tradition is still very strong. It may be changing. There's a lot of debate in Nova Scotia about those sorts of changes, and that's an important debate. But I think the language is so much a part of the tradition and so much a part of the culture as it is here, that every effort has to be made to save the language for future generations. For nothing else, for the pleasure and the connections it gives. That was always my first reason for learning the language, and it's what keeps me going. It's the relationships and the culture that's transmitted. These are always important things, perhaps more important in the present era than they've been for a long, long time.
Well, thank you so much for that, Rob. It's been a great evening, and thank you everyone for your questions. Just time for me to say thank you so much to Professor Rob Dunbar for giving this year's lecture. Thank you to Delina McClellan for introducing our lecture. Special thanks to Heather, who's been keeping me sane behind the scenes. And to all our attendees, we really hope you've enjoyed this evening. As you know, we've recorded this, so it will be available in the next few days on our website, on the Saltire Society website. So thank you all again, and hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.